one more minute. We'll go ahead and get started here shortly. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Wilcox. I will be the moderator. I'm the director of Scarbrough Transportation. Our speaker today is Geoff Chambers. Geoff is the director of supply chain services here at Scarbrough. And so today's webinar we will address the cost containment in your supply chain. I want to thank you for joining us today. But before we get started, I wanted to make sure we address a couple of items. Q&A at the top of your screen can be used to ask questions throughout the presentation, and all questions will be answered towards the end of the slide presentation. Depending on time, if we do not have enough time to address your specific questions, we will certainly send you a response via your registered email address along with the slide deck. So the recording of the webinar will be on Scarbrough Group's YouTube channel as well. Scarbrough webinars are part of our continuing education program to bring knowledge, equip you with key tools, and discuss a diverse range of topics indicative of today's global and domestic marketplace. One other thing to mention, our next webinar is duty reduction on October 5th at 1 p.m. with Allison Schroer. So let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. Geoff, if you want to give us an overview of 2022 and 2023, we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll ask marketing to move our slide up to the next few. Slide number 3. As they're working on slide number 3 right now, I'll go ahead and get started. One of the things that we wanted to address was really the dynamics of negotiating transportation expenditures in the supply chain. COVID obviously taught a lesson on how we view cost containment in the supply chain, as well as all the changes that have taken place, not only in the parcel landscape and the LTL landscape, but also the truckload landscape. So if we go pre-COVID, in the last 5-6 years, there was a specific way of rolling out RFPs in the marketplace to really reduce expenditures. It was primarily done on an annual basis, but because of so many veiled accessorial charges, both in the parcel landscape as well as LTL specifically, there are all types of calculators that are being used now that have a really big impact on your overall transportation spend. I'll give one example briefly. I was talking to a client here a couple of weeks ago, and they were complaining about accessorial charges. And when I did a brief study of what they were doing, 34% of their expenditures were attributed to accessorial charges. So it's very, very important to have a high level of analytics and tools to really improve efficiency, visibility, and overall ROI, and to bring to the forefront of the equation. Going on to the next slide, I'd like to touch on one word that is going to follow our next presentation, which is going to be supply chain planning, supply chain modeling, which will be on October 12th. So we're going to introduce the word holistically. Now you'll see some circles, you'll see some departments. On this slide, I only included a few departments. However, you could add IT, finance, all the other departments and business units that are associated. And the one thing that I learned early on in my career, working with Toyota Motors, is really you have to look at everything circular versus linear. We have a tendency to look at things as what's behind us versus looking at everything circular. If you think of looking at everything circular, then it's not a matter of if there's going to be another supply chain disruption or if there's going to be an increase of charges. It's really when, because if you put a mark on a tire, at some point that mark is going to come back around. And I really learned that through lean methodology. And it's very, very important to have each department have a holistic viewpoint and get away from functional siloed planning. Functional siloed planning really came to the forefront in the 90s. In 1996, there was a supply chain program called SCORE, which was a very good program at the time, and essentially addressed 4 items: plan, source the material, develop or produce the material, and deliver the material. And most recently, they added to SCORE digitization. So while at the time, re-engineering was a big word in the 90s and coincided with SCORE, more and more companies are understanding the value add to look at their corporation holistically versus functional silos, because SCORE's focus is on functional silos. So you can see how transportation has a direct correlation to operations, customer service, and sales. While transportation is certainly not the nucleus of the company, all of those different departments all have a functional and intrinsic responsibility.
Yeah, Geoff, can you touch a little bit on some of the impacts for a total cost of an organization when an organization operates in a siloed capacity? From experience, I've seen a few and worked for a few companies that everything was siloed and operating differently or by themselves without looking at total impact of the organization.
Well, I think if I use an example, just a visual example, let's say that the company, each department had a rowboat. One of the things that you do in a rowboat is you look behind, you get a visual picture of a goal of a place that you want to reach, and you row towards that goal. When you go into a functional siloed plan, there are different objectives and different goals for each functional silo, and those don't often coincide. Furthermore, the communication, I'm going to use an example. It's very important for customer service to know by zone what their costs are so they can return, at least even if they have free freight charges, they can get a return on their investment. Same thing for sales. When you have your sales department out in the market selling product, they need a zonal map with weight delineation to ensure that you're getting ROI. Again, even if you have free freight, what is that number and how it affects the company holistically?
Excellent.
We go to the next slide. So the dynamics of holistic visibility is very, very simply understood by the example I gave. Operations will have specific KPIs, customer service has KPIs, and sales has KPIs. Now, in our supply chain modeling and planning seminar or webinar, I will get into this even deeper on how these different departments are affected. But today we wanted to stay more focused on cost containment, because really cost containment is the first phase of developing a successful supply chain model and plan. Again, we've often found, just several months ago, I talked to a company that was using a formula back from 2010 to calculate charges to the end user, depending on what state they were in. And, come to find out they were losing money on transportation. So if we go to the next slide. In 2023 and 2022, we saw a drastic change. Truckload costs, which were extremely high, along with ocean pricing, everyone got hit with cost, drayage pricing. All modes of transportation got crushed during the COVID pandemic. In 2022, we started to see a downward trajectory of pricing per mile, as well as an increase in fuel. So while fuel right now is tracking about 20% above last year at this time, it's on the increase again. We're seeing that truckload costs in general have certainly dropped back even to pre-pandemic. I'm talking probably back to 2008. And in addition to that, there was an average in June of 3,000 trucking companies that were going out of business or acquired through acquisition. Of course, the biggest one of those that we all heard about was YRC, who'd been around for a long, long time. If we think about the circle again, and we think about the spot market, it's also very cyclical. And it's really something that we need to look at circularly versus on a linear basis. So that's very, very important.
Yeah, Geoff, when you think about YRC, for example, Yellow going out of business and other trucking companies and the importance of cost containment, what kind of impact do you expect on that transportation market with the different companies going out of business?
Well, there's a couple of things. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has pointed to an upward trend of employment in the trucking industry, over the road truckload industry. The only way that could be happening is, by the way, the Bureau of Labor Statistics website is bls.gov. It also has the producer's price index for every commodity that you can think of, including transportation, since transportation is commodity. But what we're seeing more of is smaller companies, depending on their safety and overall operations, are joining forces with larger companies. So smaller companies, 100 trucks smaller, there have been several companies that I've seen articles on here in the last several months that are offering these smaller carriers to pull their trailers at a decreased fee and be a part of their program. So that would explain the upward trend in overall employment for over-the-road trucking. So I think we're going to see, Matt, to answer your question, we're going to see more acquisition take place. We're going to see more companies go out of business, unfortunately, because they're not going to be able to maintain, especially with the increase in fuel costs, again, on an upward trajectory. A lot of forecasts that I've read recently, diesel is approaching $5 and will go over $5 a gallon.
Good. Thank you.
And the next slide, please. So according to the Department of Transportation in April, 750,000 active motor carriers that own or lease one tractor Out of those, 95.8% operate 10 or fewer tractors, 99.7 operate 100 or fewer tractors. So again, back to what I said about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, more and more of those companies that cannot maintain, that are factoring their receivables, are lodging with bigger trucking companies, which makes a lot of sense. You can see on the right there a chart of spend. This was as of July, annualized spend in the United States. And what I'd like to do now is get a little more into the acquisition and what I've seen in the industry historically, because again, we're talking about a circular dimension versus a linear, what's behind us. So when we think about the IEPs, when we think about the railroads, IEPs being intermodal equipment providers, I can remember when I first started in the industry, there was a privately owned railroad called the Denver Rio Grande Railroad, the DRGW. I was asked by the vice president of the DRGW to write a docket to what was once the Interstate Commerce Commission, who is now the Surface Transportation Board, to write a docket to the ICC about the acquisition of the Southern Pacific. So I did so because we did a lot of business with the DRGW. Consequently, what we've seen over the years now is a tremendous amount of acquisitions in the railroad world. So what was once the BN, I remember dealing with the BN Direct. I remember after deregulation when the Burlington Northern bought out or moved the majority of their salespeople because they had all of these 3PLs out selling their services. So the BNS, you have the BNSF now, that you have the UPSP, you have the Norfolk Southern and the CSX. I used to deal with Conrail on the East Coast. Both the Norfolk Southern and CSX absorbed Conrail. So you can just see an example. Again, if we're looking at that circle and, history repeats itself, we can see how a lot of acquisitions are going to continue to monopolize our industry. So it's very, very important to establish long-term relationships with these bigger carriers to ensure that you have sustainability in the long term, because I'm looking at everything long term and trying to give you a little history to support the long-term objectives. From the LTL standpoint, since 2013, there have been over 5,000 NMFC reclassifications. So what that means is that, and the hardest hit industry was the auto industry, where it seemed like everything automotive was at Class 70. Class 70 then became a group of sub-classifications all the way to Class 250. So that has been a huge change. And of course, when a product is misclassified in LTL and you're not catching it because you're using an older NMFC number, you're seeing a lot of weight and inspection certificates that are coming from the LTL carriers, which can be a huge expense. And not only that, but a lot of the LTL carriers are going to dynamic pricing. And dynamic pricing is another big change in LTL. UPS announced yesterday, in tow with FedEx, by the way, that they were also going to a dynamic pricing model. Dynamic is fine, but dynamic kind of works like this week or this day for this zone is we're going to give you a greater discount than you would get before. But unless you have more than one carrier in place in LTL and parcel, then dynamic pricing does not work in the long run. So something that the LTL and parcel industry is doing as a relatively big change that can benefit you one day and then be a strike against you on another. Going back to parcel, we had our first webinar last month, and I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and view the dynamics of what's changing in parcel. This year was a historic year of 6.9% GRI for both FedEx and UPS. They both announced just recently 5.9. However, under the veil, there's anywhere from 5 to 12% increases in their accessorial charges. So accessorial charges already have reached an all-time high this year. So those are going to go up again next year. So it's very important. And according to Oxford Economics, and if you don't have access, it's a good publication as far as from a domestic and global world outlook, because we're not the only country facing the issues that we're facing. They had announced that 26% of shippers or BCOs are using TMSs, which TMSs are transportation management systems. The majority are using Excel to track their contracts, which is a very antiquated way. Either that or they're using API calls. They're going to the carrier website and putting in zip to zip with their classification, and they're doing an API call, which can be around between 5 and 7% error ratio. In addition to that, Oxford Economics also stated that only about 20% of BCOs or shippers truly understand the dynamics of LTL and parcel contracts.
That's a scary number, only 20%.
Yeah, yes, it is. And on to the next slide, please. Every company is, integrated business planning is something that that's long overdue. Cost containment obviously is very strategic means of starting your phases into supply chain, and as well as scenario planning and modeling. But let's touch on some of the efficiencies in cost containment. If we can go on to the next slide. Obviously, the goal is to reduce costs, but not at the expense of losing relationships that you have had with your current truckload providers, LTL providers. We're here to educate you. We're here to help you. We recognize that each company that we deal with has really very specific interests and goals. And it's our responsibility as a product and service provider is to give you some key information and to be a consulting arm for you to take you to that place. Back to Matt's question, how you go from a functional siloed planning company, its impact to a holistic plan. So the first thing we look at is operating efficiencies. One thing that we do is, and another statistic I'll throw out there from Oxford Economics, according to internal process, that only 50% of supply chain executives had the abilities to change internal processes and streamline communications between departments holistically. So that's one thing that we really focus on is in the internal processes to streamline those communications. Mode conversion and shipment consolidations. This is probably, in my 40-year career, this is probably one of the best times that I can think of to RFP your LTL, your parcel, your truckload, and to really look not at the short-term objectives, but look at the long-term relationships. So mode conversions, the IEPs, back to them for a minute, their statistics were running about 16% idle on their equipment. So their COFC equipment was about 16% this year sitting idle. So oftentimes mode converting from truckload to intermodal is a very viable option, and normally works on shipments over 1,000 miles. Optimized carrier pricing programs with unified fuel and accessorial matrices. Some of the questions that we get asked are, will UPS, will FedEx, will any of these carriers work or negotiate fuel? And the answer is yes. Can you create a unified accessorial matrix? Yes. Can you get items waived out of a contract? Yes, you can. So mitigation or reduction of GRIs is really, really important. And volume transportation aggregation obviously means we're going to bring as much consolidated purchase to the market as possible for cost containment solutions. And then, of course, class exception performance, which is commonly known as FAKs. Under operations expertise, we also think it's paramount that we have quarterly business reviews with analytics and performance KPIs for reporting. We're also very in tune with zonal heat maps for your customer service department, for your sales department, so they know what they're doing in the field, as well as with their customers on the telephone when they're selling your products. And you have on-demand supply chain services consultation. And like I said, I've been in the business over 38 years now, approaching close to 40. And as well as Allison has been on our international side for many, many years. So a lot of consulting dynamics that we have at Scarbrough. The third one is operations economies of scale. So much of the time, because the supply chain and transportation expenditures have been such a focus of companies since COVID, really, they lose sight of their core competencies. So it's our goal to bring value to you by providing analytics to be an extension of your company to provide economies of scale to make qualitative assessments. And it's very, very important when you're a C-suite executive that you have fluid transportation expenditures and you accrue for freight charges correctly. For example, I'm just going to use back to parcel. You could be, as a C-level executive, you could be say, okay, it's 6.9% rate increase this year in 2023. I'll add 6.9% to our forecast. And, coming on into third quarter, you realize that your costs have gone up 12, 15%. That's because of accessorial charges. So it's very important to understand cost containment from all avenues. And that's what we like to address, and hopefully that gives you a broad overview of some of the efficiencies of cost containment, as well as a little bit of history and a little bit of the dynamics of looking at everything holistically. And like I said, this word holistic will flow through into our supply chain planning and modeling webinar coming up on October 12th. Matt, I guess I'll open up to any questions.
Sure, let's go ahead and move into the Q&A section, or part of our webinar. First question that came in, it says, you mentioned the need for extremely specific KPIs when negotiating transportation. Can you provide the group with a few examples?
Absolutely. First and foremost, safety stats. Safety is with the nuclear lawsuits. I can remember when the general public lawsuits, general public liability lawsuits against trucking companies were $1 million, and that was a big number. Now they're 20, 30, $40 million. So safety, number one, Matt. On-time service performance is another big one. OS&D, overage, shortage, and damage is another big one. How their transit times and their capabilities affect your distribution operations, I think, is another thing that's very important, as well as the big word that everyone is looking for, and that is visibility. So end-to-end supply chain visibility.
Excellent. Another question we have here is, says this ties into your 3 efficiencies of cost containment, but how would you recommend you offset the rising cost of fuel surcharge in today's market?
That's a very good question. The one thing that we can do is, we can't control what the market's doing in the Department of Energy and what they produce every Monday as far as the national averages. What we can do for you is come up with a unified fuel surcharge matrix, so you will be able to effectively quantify what the fuel surcharge is going to be for that week, and all the carriers will be on the same fuel surcharge matrix. And again, a lot of people have thought that I've talked to, and Matt, I'm sure you have as well, that fuel is a non-negotiable.
Yes.
It is certainly a negotiable, and the best way to do that is through a unified fuel surcharge matrix.
Absolutely. Another question here. Does it make sense to utilize your transportation department to send out requests for spot quotes in today's market?
That's a very good question. So you have to ask yourself, I'll ask a question back on that one. So do short-term objectives generate long-term resiliency? And what I mean by that is, you have someone drilling out email every day for the lowest bidder, and keeping in mind those 5 KPIs that I just mentioned, safety being in the top of the heap. But you have someone's time that is sending out rates across a network of property brokers, carriers, whatever the case may be. It's not really looking at the big picture. It's looking at this short window of time versus a long-term objective of developing a relationship with carriers and establishing cost containment. Because if you're doing that now, how are you going to accrue in second quarter of 2024 when the market has a huge transitional change and you've not accrued for those charges? So it's really, Matt, to your question, it's not looking at the company holistically, and it's looking at very short-term objective versus long-term resiliency.
Yeah, my experience is the relationship that you have with your carrier goes a long ways too when the rates do switch and are in favor of the carrier as well. So
absolutely,
and you lose some of your credibility, I think, by chasing rates all the time. So
absolutely.
Another question we have here is when do you weigh service from a carrier versus low cost in transportation? So at what point in time do you look at their value as far as of their service versus just going with a low cost carrier all the time or low cost solution?
That's another good question. I think you have to look at the big picture. So let's take LTL, for example. Let's say that FedEx has put in place in the LTL. They won the RFP across the board. However, when you're going to Zone 6, they're a little more expensive. And normally, believe it or not, the differences in what you were talking about earlier in sending out these blanket emails out for spot quotes, the differences overall we're talking about $10, $15, $20. So the question really becomes is, looking at it, holistically again, do you really boot out a carrier or move to a different carrier just because of one zone being a little higher? What is the overall company objective is really the way to look at that.
Okay. Another question, what is your view on the impact of Amazon's growth of its own network on the overall transportation market?
Yeah, that's a big topic. I think it's on every publication I get every day, and it's a good question. I think that Amazon is certainly a big player, and there's certainly some dynamics that they're working through that are going to be evolving. Amazon was certainly a trend setter as far as on-time service, and e-commerce had a tremendous impact. So I think with a lot of companies like Shopify, for example, a lot of companies are joining the ranks with Amazon, fulfilling through Amazon DCs and the like. So if you're in the e-commerce model and it makes sense, the Amazon way to go is oftentimes very, very prudent. But obviously, there's a lot of homework involved in that decision.
Okay. Another question we have here is, would you recommend annual RFPs or negotiating annually with each of your carriers, and why?
As I said previously, in my history in this industry, this is probably one of the most opportune times that I can remember to do an annual RFP across all modes. Why? The industry as a whole is, truckload is down because of YRC. There's been some uptick in the LTL, but the LTL industry is still not where it should be, or it's not back to pre-pandemic levels. The IEPs have 16% of their equipment that's been sitting idle all year long. So I think there's just, Matt, a huge opportunity based on what's happened as a backlash of COVID and the overstocking of inventory that the BCOs have had, and depleting that inventory, which has reduced the number of truckloads and LTL shipments. In fact, a lot of the LTL shipments, and we'll address this in our next webinar, but a lot of the LTL shipments have gone right back to the BCO and out of the warehouse and movement versus out to the consumer or the distributor. So I think, like I said, I think this is just the best opportunity that I've ever seen. That the dynamics in the industry, everyone is hungry. The stats came out today on what UPS lost to FedEx because of the potential strike as of August 1st. that finally came to fruition at the tune of $30 billion over the year of the Teamsters contract. They lost around 400,000 packages a day. UPS did to FedEx. So UPS is in a buying mode for business, as well as all the other truckload and LTL providers in the marketplace. So Matt, I think, and you would agree, this is a great opportunity to do an annual RFP in all modes of transportation.
Absolutely. I think the timing is perfect, to be honest with you. So another quick question we have here, are all the LTL carriers currently using dynamic pricing?
No, they are not. Historically, what we would do would be go to like a common rate base, like the most common rate base is Czar Light, that's put out by the Southern Motor Carrier Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. Czar Light and the Southern Motor Carrier Conference essentially create all the contracts for the LTL carriers. Now, while there's a good percentage of the LTL carriers that are trying to push dynamic pricing, including UPS and FedEx as parcel providers, not all have chosen that route. Now, the best way to negotiate a dynamic model is, obviously you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, is to come up, for an example, a regional LTL carrier that's on a specific rate base, and then using dynamic when it makes sense. And then, of course, the one thing that we can do along with customer service, sales, and internally is create that map where it makes sense. And that also includes your suppliers. So transitioning to inbound collect and using your aggregated transportation purchase on the inbound side as well. We can do the routing guides for that.
Excellent. We're running towards the end of the questions. I've got another one here. Says here, upfront communication and accurate information is critical. Can you touch on the impact of transportation costs when information is incorrect? For example, demurrage costs, reway fees.
Yeah, that's another good question. Fortunately, when we talk about demurrage costs, we have an in-house, in fact, in your department, have a very dynamic in-house milestone means of tracking that container when it hits the ramp, when it goes to the ramp, when it empties out at the facility, when it returns back. So it has all the milestones as far as demurrage or detention. So we have that pretty well covered. But what we try to do is to, as far as communication, is to do as much as we can electronically, and that's through EDI. So EDI is a critical piece of communication. And as far as our own TMS, Matt, as you know, has a dashboard that provides a lot of cumulative analytics that not only include in transit, but what's shipped and what's delivered and the like. So fortunately, we've been able to address a lot of the communication and inaccurate data through EDI and through our products that we're offering, including the dedicated drayage management piece.
One other question here I have here is that we're currently using Excel and spreadsheets to make carrier selections based on the region that we're shipping to. How do you convince executives and or the finance department to move to a TMS from Excel?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, Excel is it served its purpose back in the day. But you know, having a TMS, the cost of having a TMS, I'm not talking about purchasing it, I'm talking about managed transportation, like through our own transportation department on your side. It is a win-win over Excel. Not only is it a good sell for executives because essentially they don't have an upfront investment. um, we can effectively load um, our negotiated pricing on your behalf, what you've negotiated that you want to stick with, and our TMS at a very, very low cost. So it's really a win-win. Plus, you have the analytics. You're moving away from Excel. You're moving away from that functional siloed plan of Excel, and this is what I do, and it's all in Excel, versus the whole company having visibility. Um, and then you have the high level of analytics that come out of the TMS. So to me, without the upfront costs, it's really a win-win to bring it into our TMS.
Good. Couple things here real quick. Look into 2024. Any advice or any recommendations? Or what do you see?
I would say consider going to market in the next 2 quarters. First and foremost, to really, really take advantage of what is happening in our marketplace today. Back to forecast, Matt, we've heard a lot of things like it may be second quarter of 2024 before we really start to see a shift. There's also the Fed's meeting next month. They just convened, I believe it was yesterday, without another increase in interest. So I would anticipate 2024 being a somewhat volatile first quarter, and then I would anticipate the rebound happening sometime mid-year in 2024. So the quicker you can work on your forecast, your RFPs, the better. Because we know, going back to that circle, it's not a matter of if pricing is going to go up, it's a matter of when. And it's that spot on the tire. So I can't stress that enough, that it's just an opportune time to go to RFP and to prepare and also forecast for those hidden veiled accessorial charges and get those reduced, so you can give your C exec a very good transportation accrual process.
How often do you recommend meeting with your carriers and also doing a review of those accessorial charges?
That's part of the QBRs. So we do that on a quarterly basis. Historically, you would have the meeting with your key people at your customer, and then after that, have a meeting with each carrier's representation to go over their operating ratio. You want to see their operating ratio. They do not like to give that, but especially when you start talking about general rate increases, and then talk about their OS&D and any other issues that are effectively happening that that need to be improved upon. Of course, if it's an intrinsic problem that cannot be fixed, then obviously we'll take measures long before that quarter, but normally it's on a quarterly basis.
A couple of reminders real quick as we start winding down here. Again, our next webinar on duty reduction is October 5th at 1 p.m. with Allison Schroer. And then we also have, Geoff will have another webinar on October 12th for supply chain modeling and planning. so at 1 p.m. So if there are no other questions, Geoff, I don't know if you have any other comments before we wrap up, but if not, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining today and being part of the Scarbrough Group. We're very excited about educating and bringing you cutting edge terminology that's changing every day, it seems like, as well as supply chain and global solutions, as well as domestic transportation solutions across your network. So thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent. I would, as we conclude our webinar on cost containment, I would like to thank Geoff, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending. So I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.